Hi guys, it's Luetin here, and we're back for another Minx and Luetin Discuss. And today we're going to be talking about survival horror games, where they have come from, where they went to, and where they're going to next. They've changed around quite a lot, and I think it would be true to say that lately they have gone slightly off of the rails. Minx, do you want to sort of jump in here and just give people a little thought about, give me a thought about where survival horror games have been at the moment?
Well, they have been at the moment. I'd say survival horror as a genre doesn't really exist in the same way it does. Perhaps perhaps in the indie scene there is remnants of it there, but in terms of AAA games, there really isn't a lot there. If you think about probably the last big two offerings on the survival horror front, you're thinking, well, no, the last two offerings on the horror front, sorry. You're thinking about Dead Space 3, and you're thinking about Resident Evil 6,
Yep.
for example, both of which are incredibly action heavy,
Yep.
not particularly scary, more like shoot all the monsters type games with no real suspense or atmosphere to them. I mean, I guess there are moments of suspense and atmosphere in both, but considering what earlier entries in the same franchises were like in comparison, these
Yeah.
are certainly much more action heavy, blast them all, much more.
House of the Dead, but without the fun, right?
Exactly, yeah. Much more accessible game. I say accessible, and I say that as a bad thing for the most
Yes,
part,
yes.
because accessible tends to mean appealing to the mainstream audience. And the mainstream audience doesn't want to be scared. The mainstream audience doesn't want to feel unsettled or uncomfortable or be challenged with adult themes for the most part. And both of them sort of like bleed into that market, and as a result, they lose some of what at their very core made the franchises what they are.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, AAA games have become so expensive now, like ridiculously expensive. There is a lot of talk that, AAA games kind of can't be allowed to fail.
That's
In
true.
one way or another, they have to make that money back because it's just too much. There's too many people's jobs at stake. So it's not like, in the past where you would have a developer and they'd make a game and it would kind of fail maybe, and you'd be like, oh no, well, we didn't do that well this year, we'll make another one. No, it's like if you fail with these AAA games, it's really a big deal. And these games tend to now inherently, whether it's survival horror or anything actually, but as a sort of area, they do tend to inherently sort of follow market trends, and we do see lately more games just pandering to an audience rather than producing unique titles that make the player learn and feel something new, maybe something that there's elements that they don't like, something where they start and they really struggle and they don't do well with, and again, I'm thinking of titles like Fast and Light, which is an indie game, not a AAA, but it's a good example of a game which it puts the pressure on the player. You have to understand that game. You have to really work hard to get through that game. And if you don't, the game will punish you for it. And, I guess it's kind of ironic that these AAA, series, in trying to put together games which have that mass appeal, the mechanics seem to have now sort of alienated the player base. And it's just, I'm just taking that impression from the general reactional mood that I've seen from the community. But with large horror games of late, I think it's fair to say that they've not really been what people expected, and they've kind of failed because of that. And I think people have started to just almost turn away from it. So I think with things upcoming like Alien Isolation, like Evil Within, those are a couple of AAA titles which it's going to be interesting to really see whether they do well in the community, whether they're taken on board. And I think both of those games are sort of, obviously Evil Within, it's a pretty benchmark production there, and it'll be interesting to sort of see what they can put together, right?
Yeah, I think that Evil Within and Alien Isolation, I feel like from what I've seen of Evil Within, it is fairly action orientated. It obviously does, from also what I've seen, have moments that look like pure moments of terror, pure horror moments, which is something, again, games have been lacking as well as an overall, in my opinion. Like, stuff in the Evil Within looks like it would fit into an indie title like Outlast, for example, which, is a good thing in my opinion. I feel that they're both almost like tests for seeing how the horror market is in the AAA space now. I feel that the success of moving forward with more horror titles in the AAA space lies with these two games. If they both do really well, then we could see a ton of horror titles. And while that might not always be a good thing, because I'm sure some of them will be bad, in overall opinion, that is a good thing, because I feel the AAA space has been moving away from horror for a long time, and now it's time for a comeback. It's time for the days of Resident Evil and Silent Hill to return, but with new franchises, as it were. And Hopefully, Alien Isolation, and Evil Within will prove well. Hopefully, Silent Hill PT
Yeah.
will also do well. That certainly seems to be taking an interesting approach to the genre as well.
I think it's about getting back to really that sort of the fear aspect rather than obviously the shooting aspect. Now that might sound quite sort of straightforward and obvious, but games can be very clever about how they do that. Think about Resident Evil, and one of the things that people sort of, obviously it is kind of like the core feature of the game, but it's something that maybe isn't commented on, and maybe, I don't know, maybe you guys as gamers haven't always sort of really felt or analysed it in that way, is that just the camera angles was the main deal with that game. I mean, it's the core feature of the game, and just that in itself really created the fear, because it put you in a really claustrophobic situation. It put you on the back foot always. There were many times where you just really couldn't see what was coming at you, and it made it more terrifying because of that. You were just in a very kind of uncomfortable position. So the game, in a way, was already kind of punishing you right out of the gate, and then obviously you have all the survival aspects on top of that. Then you get to like Resident Evil 4, and they really changed it up, and that's where it started to go downhill. Now, I actually like Resi 4, but that really was the kind of tipping point where they changed it, and it started to go in this more action-orientated situation. And I don't think that that's a particularly good thing. You look at Silent Hill, and again, Silent Hill, you remember back to Silent Hill 1 and Silent Hill 2, they both, there was combat there, but overall, the overarching sort of feel and the overarching sort of situation for you was a lot of wandering around in the fog, and it's the sounds which really got to you. You know, you'd be walking down corridors, and just the sounds, and they really get in your head. And I remember at some point, it was like in the first Silent Hill, I think, I was walking around in the hospital or whatever, and I was just like, there was nothing going on. I was just like, I can't take this anymore. I've got to get out of here. You know, it was just this fear of the environment and nothing else, really.
It's interesting, really. Silent Hill, permit me to, like, I guess, fangirl a bit. Silent Hill is a series I feel that's actually taken steps forward and steps back at different points in its, like, history, as it were. So you take Silent Hill 1 and 2. 2, I'm gonna go give my fangirl rant about 2. 2 is one of the best horror games ever made. It has some of the most messed up themes. It has, like, some of the darkest sort of, like, characters and plot devices, and just generally it is one of the few amazing horror games. It is just literally phenomenal. Even now, I played it a few years ago again. It's phenomenal. Like, it really is. And it has just some of the best. I'm speechless, actually, almost at how good Silent Hill 2 is. It's just absolutely phenomenal. And Silent Hill 1 and 2, like you said, there wasn't much combat. There was combat that wasn't a huge amount, and the combat was very restrictive. Yeah. If you move ahead to Silent Hill 3, that's when it started like, oh, let's put in as many monsters as possible and make it heavy combat. And I hated Silent Hill 3. I know a lot of people love Silent Hill 3. I hated it because it became too combat heavy, and that the story took second place to the combat, in my opinion, in Silent Hill 3. But then the series kind of, I feel, move forward again, because Silent Hill 4, again, is fairly combat light, and I actually really like Silent Hill 4. Not a lot of people do, but I actually thought Silent Hill 4, I think, is amazing too. And it's a series that's sort of like gone back and forth. I would say that the more recent titles like Downpour and Homecoming were more combat heavy once more, and more action heavy. And, you know, it's a series that's gone back and forth. Because Shattered Memories, of course, didn't really have any combat at all. Yeah. And it's almost like they've been desperately trying to find out which one works, but they were never really sure. And I always feel that's the same case looking at PT, because PT is like they're like, well, we've run out of ideas. The last one didn't do very well. We've got to reboot it somehow. Let's put someone having their face sucked by a giant tentacle, and everything's going to be fucking great. And hopefully PT will be great. I'm not criticizing PT, but you know what I mean. Like, I feel that if all franchises needed a reboot, actually I do feel Silent Hill did need one, because it has an almost schizophrenic history of just changing what it does again and again and again.
I think as well, you got to think about the way in which these games have been made, and the fact the narrative is very important. I actually think that Silent Hill 2 had quite a good narrative, despite it being off the wall. And I think that's a really key factor. I think many games just don't have that strong of a narrative. And I think in a survival horror game, in a fear situation, you really need that. You need a reason to be there, and you need to sort of have something which is carrying you through. If it's literally just a shooting gallery going point to point, just going bam, 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 that repetition loses momentum with you very, very quickly, and it suddenly becomes just a drag. It's not scary, you're just pointing and clicking. And I think, again, that's sort of part and parcel of this whole new thing of like pandering to people and saying like, okay, people like that action bit, they like the mechanic of bang and bang and bang. And I think there's a fear of making more narrative-led games. Now, I've got to say, I think this is changing around because we're seeing more indie games which are totally narrative-led and doing very, very well. They don't really have any kind of combat in or whatever at all. In fact, maybe not even many mechanics. They tend to just be sort of narrative-led almost, which kind of, you get to the point where you're questioning, are those actually games? But that's a different matter.
Yeah. We'll talk about that another time. I feel that is a relevant topic, though. I
think it's an interesting one. I mean, there's loads of games that are very, very good, actually, which are like that. But I think, that is a good topic for another time. But yeah, I think that bleeds into the horror aspect as well. As I say, there are some really, really great titles out there. I mean, the original Dead Space had a pretty good story overall.
Dead Space was great.
I thought it was quite believable, and I think that's a really key factor as well, as making it sort of realistically believable. Something that kind of pull you in and really immerse you. I always feel that a lot with science fiction in general, whether it's like TV, films, or games. For me, like, if it's believable, if it's not too off the wall, if they can kind of give you rationales and sort of logical reasons for things, I feel that enables you to connect more with the game. Yeah, if it's totally off the wall and just crazy, I just feel like you often kind of don't identify with it as well. And I think that is more so in survival horror games. I really feel like that fear is cultivated by your relationship with the game. And if you're really sucked into it, if you really feel for the character and you really feel like, I'm in this situation, that just pushes it so much harder. And I think you can't get that with the action because there's too much going on. So you don't have time to be sort of pulled into the game, right? But I have to say, from what I played of like Alien Isolation, and I did play a little bit of The Evil Within, and yeah, it's got a bit more combat. But both of those games, I feel like it is sort of getting back to that thing of, we're allowing you to come into the game and we're putting you in those situations. So yeah.
Interesting. I mean, I will say with the action front, this is going off on a little bit of a tangent, but it is about action. It doesn't even necessarily have to be gunplay. If the repetition of, say, scares, or say the way the gameplay works is so repetitive that that removes the horror aspects. I'm going to rant about a certain game that everyone knows that I fucking hate. I'm going to rant about Outlast. Outlast, a lot of people think it's one of the best horror games of the last decade. I would strongly disagree. I would feel that it was so in your face with how... There's no combat in Outlast, obviously. I just feel it's so in your face with the scares that it gets really... So, I don't know if you've played Outlast, but the pattern of Outlast is walk along, some guy turns up, he chases you for 10 minutes, you run around blindly, smacking into walls, desperately trying to get away, sometimes running through almost like a scripted sequence with him chasing you like in a set route. Sometimes you're like running around trying to get to a lever and his like arse is in the way and you have to hide a bit and then he goes away and then you pull the lever. But that is basically Outlast, especially the original game. Like,
do you know what it makes me think of?
What's that?
Haunting Ground.
Oh yeah,
immediately. It's just like that.
It's like Haunting Ground, except less rape. Well, maybe not less rapey, but you know what I mean. Yeah. It's certainly on that grounds, and less Japanese is probably a better way of putting it, actually.
Yeah. By the way, if none of you have seen Haunting Ground, I strongly recommend it. It's a very funny game.
It's fucking terrible. Haunting Ground is fucking terrible.
The character, she's so hilarious.
It's one of the worst games I've ever played, but at the same time, I like watching other people suffer through it.
Yeah.
And just how traumatic playing Haunting Ground is in general.
I think there's a lot of games that are like that, and actually, just on that topic, I want to mention and I want to shout out, Steve Heartless, his Call of Cthulhu playthrough. We were just talking about this before, and I want to mention it to people because I feel like if you haven't watched that playthrough, you're missing out, like, in a massive, massive way.
It's fat, guys.
Yeah, I'm going to link it down below. I mean, Minx, tell me what you like about that playthrough because I want to hear.
Just general helplessness, how bad he is at the game, and just the way it just fucks him over constantly. like a load of there's so many episodes, and some of the episodes is just him dying on the same sequence non-stop. There's like one episode where he's running around in the warehouse trying to look for something and the enemies keep respawning and he just gets slowly whittling away his ammo, and he's no idea what's happening, and it's pretty amazing, like how frustrated he gets as well.
It's the game mechanics as well, and I think this kind of shows that like there can be a load of other things going on in the game which just make it so much more fun. And it's like the game mechanics, like they're so terrible in that game. It's so awful. Like there's a bit where he's sort of coming into this warehouse area and he's talking, and one of the NPC guys just floats across the room, and he's like, "What the hell?" Like it's just so insane. I also remember there was one part where he's trying to get out of this building, and you have to like turn and put the bolt in the door and then turn back.
That sequence is infamous. That sequence is infamous.
Go back and like, and then he has to jump from like one outside staircase to another, and like even so he tries to do the door lock like 3 or 4 times and fails, and then he eventually does it and goes to jump out the window and then fails because the mechanic just makes him fall like a stone. And it's like, God's sake.
That whole section, that whole chase sequence in Call of Cthulhu is one of the infamous horror moments, especially with its difficulty. But anyway, Outlast. Basically, the use of constant fear in Outlast, like constant on the move, constant terror, it never lets up, detracts from the horror because it becomes to the point where that's all the only state you're in. There's no time to calm down. And Whistleblower is a better game. Like the DLC is a better title because it focuses more on the individual psychopath chasing you and builds them up more rather than just being the same fat guy a million times. You know, there is more to it than that, but it also tries to shock you as well, I'd say, the DLC, because, I mean, it has that sequence where your dick almost gets cut off and you see it, like, inches from the buzzsaw sort of thing. And I mean, I didn't find, maybe it's just some guy, I didn't find that sequence particularly horrific. I just was like, I was almost like, really? Like, you're going for that? I don't know. I really don't like the Outlast. Outlast as a whole, I just don't like it. I tried playing it again. I thought maybe I made a mistake because everyone was like, "Oh, you should play it again." You know, I'm like, I really don't like it. It's just fucking terrible.
I think that horror games and survival horror games in general are way more intricate than you would imagine. It's not just about bam bam, horrible thing, blah blah blah, gotta survive. There's way more to it. And as I say, you only have to look at games like that from like Outlast, where I think the key thing there is that you were saying about how it doesn't relent, it's just non-stop. And after a while, that's really a bad thing because it just dilutes what's happening, and you're just kind of like, yeah, blah 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 blah. You know, it's not scary anymore because it's happened to you 30 times already. You know,
there needs to be a balance though. Like, when Outlast came out on the same day, I think, actually, as Machine for Pigs, so last year's Halloween sort of like horror sort of stuff, and I feel Machine for Pigs was terrible as well, like just for the opposite reason. In Machine for Pigs, there is no threat. And it gets to the point you're like, oh, well, I'm just going to keep walking because there's no real risk to me at all.
Yeah.
Any point ever. I mean, Machine for Pigs certainly does a better job, in my opinion, as a narrative than Outlast does. But again, I didn't feel it was scary because after an hour, I realized nothing could really hurt me and there was no threat whatsoever. And I could just dick around. Yeah, you know what I mean? So the balance is somewhere in between. Both those games were extremes of doing it wrong, in my opinion, actually. And the middle ground is somewhere in the middle where things like Amnesia and the original Amnesia, not Machine for Pigs, obviously, and Silent Hill 2 and Fatal Frame 2. I'm listing great horror titles. Silent Hill 2, Amnesia, Fatal Frame 2, in particular, stick in my head as having amazing narratives and amazing suspense all at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely.
They all stick there. Fatal Frame 2 has one of the best plots in a horror game, in my opinion. I'm not just saying that because it has 2 twin girls perving each other.
You're not biased at all, like.
No, it has a really good story, and Fatal Frame 2, in my opinion, is one of the horror greats. And it's a shame that Nintendo have decided not to bless the West with the rest of the franchise at any point.
It's totally predictable.
Yeah. But you know what I mean? Like, those 3 titles, I say Amnesia. Amnesia is the greatest horror game ever made, in my opinion. There is not much that has ever come close to it, overall, in my opinion. I feel that Amnesia just...
What core aspect did it hit on there? What do you think was like that key there?
Okay, so nothing happens to you in terms of threats for about 2 hours the first time you play, I would say. And then it just delivers that, like, you go down to the basement and you've seen this thing from a distance a few times. And then you hear that sort of like music, that chase music has like that woo sort of thing. Yeah. And you're like, what the fuck is that? And then I remember looking up from I was in this tool room. I looked up and saw this thing just legging at me.
I remember that actually.
And it was one of the most terrifying moments in my entire life. And nothing has ever encapsulated how scary amnesia is. You constantly feel a threat, but you're not often at threat. But
Yeah.
when you are at threat, you're at extreme threat, and that's the balance I feel.
Yeah, I feel like that's where you need to come down on. And I have to say, I think it applies to movies too. Movies have gotten quite bad in the whole horror aspect. They always have been. It's very difficult to find a film which actually pins down that feeling of fear. And then the same with games. It's very difficult to find a game that really makes you feel fear, not just kind of I'm scared and oh my god something's going to kill me, but actual fear. And it's all about that kind of presence. It's that feeling of there's something there and I don't know what it is, and then at some point you're faced with it, and that's so terrifying. And for me as well, I hate like small things. That's what really gets to me. Like I hate it if I'm in a building in a game and I'm wandering around and I'm doing stuff and I come through a room and I'm like, okay, this, I go away. Come back like later, holy shit, something has moved. And that scares the crap out of me. Something's been there, and it's that feeling of there's something here with me. That really gets under my skin. It drives me crazy. And you know what's something, and you're like, dude, so you're just waiting for it. It's that feeling of like anticipation, just waiting for this bloody thing to come and get you, and you don't know when it's going to be. Whereas the action games, usually there's musical indicators as well. You know, it's like da 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 da, da, and you know it's coming, and you're like, you know, it's just like
monsters doing jazz hands. Just came
they're just like, we're coming to get you, ba 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 ba, and then you're just like, ha ha, bye 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 bye, and it's just like it just takes away from it. It's nothing like what you would expect from a scary game at all. And also I think like what's truly terrifying is not being equipped to deal with your situation. And I've got to say, I want to reference this. Okay, I feel like from what I've played some Alien Isolation already, and from what I feel with that game, I feel like that's what that game has got going on. But also let's also talk Last of Us a little bit as well in a sec. But yeah, with those games, I feel like the key really about making you feel fear is kind of underprepared. You know, you don't have what's necessary to deal with that. So you can't just like stand your ground and take it down. You've got to either escape or evade, and that's really where that fear comes from. But let's bleed into Last of Us, because we were sort of saying it's not really a survival horror game. It's not, but it kind of is in part. And I also feel an interesting thing about that game. Yeah, it's quite cinematic. You know,
it is. Yeah, I mean, I would say that the clicker sequences, you know, where you're sneaking around and you can hear them going like that sort of thing. That was a really bad impersonation of the clicker, by the way. But, you know, those sequences are really sort of like disorientating and nerve-wracking, and you do feel on edge. Like, you can see them through the wall, you're listening, and you think, can I get them? Will they turn around, sort of thing? And there is an air of suspense. And I remember sitting there, because I played this really recently, like I literally played it like a few weeks ago, and I was sitting there like gripping my controller, locked in, like really on edge, like thinking, what on earth, you know, like what if I mess up? And you know, and especially if you die in The Last of Us, like you're done, like you get hit almost and you're dead a lot of the time. It's really
horrible as well, the endings. Yeah, you know.
And it's really intense. Like I think it captures the intensity of survival horror in those sequences very well. You certainly feel very much at risk, very vulnerable, and even though you have an edge on the situation, the fact you can see them through the walls and stuff, you know, you still have to really think about the way you approach things.
Yeah, well, I think that was a very clever mechanic as well, because it didn't give away too much. It would often allow you to see within a certain area, but not beyond that. So that would often be a very difficult thing of you know, do I initiate this situation, but there's more there that I can't see what's happening, you know?
Yeah, exactly. It's really good, and that is, like you said, survival horror aspects are bleeding almost back into the mainstream AAA genre again, and I feel they have been. Things like that sort of show, you know, people ranted about how good those sections were, and I'm pretty sure the AAA devs do take note of things like that, and someone maybe even heard about, you know, like play those sequences themselves, a developer, or saw the critical acclaim those sequences were getting, because they did, and thought, you know, maybe it's time to make a horror game. People really seem to enjoy those sequences. And like I say, Evil Within and Alien Isolation are almost like the fruits of this new wave into the genre, as it were. So.
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm just going to use Dead Space as one other example, which I think Dead Space is the absolute perfect example of survival horror in the way that it has degraded. Because Dead Space, the first one, that came out in, 2008. Dead Space came out in 2008, Dead Space 2, 2011, Dead Space 3, 2013. And just that sort of like bump, bump, bump. It's perfect. It's like a little bit less horror, a lot less horror. You know, it's kind of like they just, and also within the time period of where that's happening, you know, so basically like the last sort of 5-6 years, it's absolutely perfect. You know, it's just, you know, we were in a period where we could make scary games still, and there's a lot of stuff going on. Dead Space, the first one, there's action in it. There's plenty of action with it. You got the cutter, you know, you can just be like bang, 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 bang. There's plenty of shooting gallery moments, but there's plenty of true fear moments as well. And Dead Space 2, it was a bit of a combination of the two things.
It had the nursery sort of section that was pretty creepy, I thought, you know, in Dead Space 2, but
and then
Dead
it just
Space
goes
3 doesn't
full
have
down.
any.
Yeah.
I mean, I actually quite like Dead Space 3, but I couldn't treat it as a horror game. It was a co-op third-person shooter. That's what Dead Space 3 is.
Yes.
You know?
Exactly. And so I think, as I say, that's just a great example, if you want to take it, to put out there of the way in which things have changed. And I think it's also, it's a great example of the way in which studios have read the market situation. I think it's much more about that than them sort of saying like, okay, what can we do to make our game better? Because I really don't think it made it better, and I don't know how you could come to that conclusion with Dead Space 3. Being no mistake though, those games are great in their own right, but I just don't think that you can sort of really take them as a survival horror. On the other hand, look at Resident Evil with its constant remakes and rehashes. And Resident Evil is a great series as well, but I feel like they've totally weakened themselves by constantly just redoing stuff and repackaging things all the time, you know? And it's like, rather than sort of going, okay, we're going to take the really truly best aspects of this game and push it in a really interesting direction, maybe something a little bit dangerous that you've not really tried, you know? And I think, like, for example, like you said, like Silent Hill Shattered Memories, that's a game that did do that. You know, they really did try to go in a different direction.
It was a totally different direction. In fact, there's no game like it. There is no game, in my opinion, like Silent Hill Shattered Memories. It goes into such a tangent to everything else that I've ever played. Even the more like the walk 'em ups that we're talking about, like more recent, it's totally different to them as well, because it has gameplay and it has fear and it's just brilliant. Silent Hill Shattered Memories is brilliant, and it probably did one of the reasons it didn't do well was on the fucking Wii. Like, I mean, no one had no one bought fucking third-party games on the Wii. What the fuck are you talking about? You know what I mean?
That's really weird, actually.
And I remember playing the fact you have to play with a fucking stupid fucking nunchuck and fucking thing doesn't help as well. You know what I mean? But I didn't like the Wii. I mean, I enjoyed some games on the Wii, but I didn't like the Wii's controller. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And it felt like I was like running a marathon uphill while playing a game every time. Not because it was like exerting, but just because it was so fucking stressful to get it to work properly. I remember trying to take fucking pictures with my phone in Silent Hill and having it swerve off screen because the sensor bar was not working properly and shit like that. You know what I mean? It was just.
I want to see that on your channel really soon. Just that, like.
I haven't even got a Wii anymore, but I have a Wii U, but I don't have a Wii. But anyway, it was. I really like Shattered Memories, and I really like horror games that do something different. I mean, even at the time, I guess, even Slender did something different because nothing that hadn't been seen before. You know what Slender was,
that
the
is
original.
True, yeah.
And while it obviously became one of the most over-milked, ridiculous cash grabs in the history of video games, at the same time, the original Slender did do what it was a new experience. I'd never played a game where something came after you like that. You know what I mean? And hunted you down. And it really did feel like that. You know what I mean?
It felt like you're in a horror film. It's got that feel going to it, you know?
And it was really good. I mean, it was good the first, 5-6 times. When it got to 27,000th time, obviously, it wasn't quite as entertaining, and it wasn't a concept that lasted. But at least it was something unique, to begin with, in Slender.
Yeah, and I think that does just kind of go to prove the whole repetition thing. You just cannot have that kind of repetition in a survival horror if you want it to maintain its fear factor. Because Slender, for as great as it is, it's just quite a simplistic game.
That's true.
And simple things can often be the best things. You know, often the simplest idea is the best idea. But from that point of view, from a longevity point of view, it just doesn't play out. But I guess, so moving into kind of the last thoughts here, there are other games coming along which are not truly maybe horror games, but more survival games. But I would say it's still an interesting balance. We have The Lone Dark, which is a really, really nice little game coming out. And it still needs, it still needs a lot of refinement, and it still needs a lot of work. But from what there is right now, it's really great. It's looking really nice. And the survival element, remember, we were talking earlier about with Silent Hill, how you often didn't see very much happening. That in itself was fearful. You don't know what's happening around you. You don't know what's there. There's this very, very unnerving feeling. And of course, there's the kind of apocalyptic deal going on as well. You're just finding dead people and you're like, what's happened here? It's that feeling of, is there something going on around me? And I would even throw DayZ in the mix, because whilst DayZ is not really a horror game, it's that survival element and the fear aspect. You have the fear all the time. Because,
but you're going to die instantly for no reason, from something you don't even see in DayZ as well, it can be.
I feel like we're moving back towards some really, really great survival horror games. I think it's one of the best sort of areas within gaming. I think it's most interesting areas within gaming, because it just, like I say, it's actually very difficult to make a very good survival horror game. So when one comes along, they're often very clever, very well scripted. And as I say, I hope that with some of the new games that are coming along, we're getting back towards that. Minx, do you have any final thoughts today?
I feel like survival horror, I feel horror as a genre in gaming has changed a lot. So you had the early roots, we're looking back at Resident Evil and Silent Hill, and obviously before that Alone in the Dark and things like that, but they are fairly similar in some ways, those titles in general, in my opinion. Then moving forward, you went into the more action-orientated phase. We've had the Resident Evil 5 and 6 and Dead Space 3, for example, are good examples of that. And almost as an answer to that, the indie titles sprung up, and they were the place to be for horror for a while. You had Amnesia, you had, to a lesser degree, Slender, I guess, and all those PC games that came out. There was tons of indie titles. There's almost too many to count, but there was a lot of indie PC horror stuff that almost sprung up in response to the action-orientated focus of the AAA horror games. Now, that almost shot itself in the foot in the end, because the indie market became so saturated. There wasn't a week would go by without another terrible fucking Unity engine horror game made by some guy in 5 minutes trying to cash in on Slender, and it just got ridiculous. And hopefully, I'm hoping that this resurgence within the AAA space, this realization by mainstream devs that horror can make money and hopefully be a big success for them. Hopefully that resurgence will revitalize the genre again, and we can move forward with innovation in both the AAA and indie space for a while. And I really hope that's what happens, because that's the evolution of the horror game so far as I see it. And I'm pretty excited to see where it goes, because obviously horror is my favorite genre.
Absolutely. All right, guys, so that's been Minx and Luetin Discuss this week. Leave your thoughts below about horror games and the horror genre, the survival horror genre. Where do you think it's going? Maybe what has been your favorite game and why? Tell us below. This is going to be available on SoundCloud to download as always. All the podcasts can be posted there. Be sure to go and check out Minx's channel and my channel. Subscribe for more of this content, and we'll see you next time for some more Minx and Luetin Discuss.
See you later, guys.